The African continent has just come together to sign the Africa Free Trade Area. Ideally, this is supposed to promote the free movement of goods and services across boundaries. However, there are still many iron curtains that still make it hard for African countries to do business and therefore realize the full potential of the continent. Now, pundits are calling for the removal of that for Africa to optimize what it has.
The Africa Continental Free Trade Area has just been ratified May 2019. So we are at the beginning of the process, the real process of implementing it. And I keep referencing the East African community, but it is the most integrated regional economic bloc in the African continent. Studies have shown that, in fact. Trademark East Africa just conducted a study with the United Nations Economic Commission on Africa, which indicated that if Eastern Africa, that includes East Africa and the Horn of Africa, were to remove the tariffs as far as recommended by the Continental Free Trade Area, would see an increase in welfare gains of over $1.8 billion. And they would see an increase in trade in that particular region of over $1.1 billion. And the big result also is we would see an increase in jobs of over 2 million jobs would be created in this area. So there is huge impetus that the Africa Continental Free Trade Area should be implemented so that there is actually free movement of people and goods. Discussions are taking place. There is a trilateral free trade area that is already being discussed. It was already being discussed by, and this is East African Community, SADC, and COMESA, the three major blocks, are already in discussions and they are talking. But the implementation is a process. In terms of realizing these gains, that potential gains of intra-Africa trade that I've just mentioned, there are first steps, first principles that have to be dealt with. That is, the first one being the rules of origin. So what determines that a product is in fact a local product in a region and that it's manufactured there? Because if that idea is agreed, then you will see products produced within the Africa continent easily bought and sold across the continent. But so discussions have already begun since the ratification of the Continental Free Trade Area. They are taking place, and it is expected that if the issue of the rules of origin is prioritized, then it will ease the movement of goods, especially for the rules of origin. What we've seen usually is that country X, the rules of origin will be agreed, but country X will say that the products of country Y actually do not meet those rules. So they will use technicalities to still create barriers for those goods to enter. So the secondary thing that has to happen after agreeing the rules of origin is also to agree a non-tariff barrier resolution and enforcement mechanism, so that if country X claims that country Y's products are not meeting a technical definition of a rule of origin, there can be, and a ruling is determined that actually does, then there should be enforcement. Currently in the East African community, it's a shortcoming that is there. There is no enforcement on non-tariff barriers. They are identified, they are talked about, they are discussed. The countries are encouraged to remove them, but there is no power for the East African Community Secretariat to enforce such. And it's something that I think should be focused on as we move on. Your issue about visas, I think it's a very important point because it stops the movement of people, the movement of labor, the movement of Africans actually within Africa. So it's something that also, again, can be copied from the East African community, where the national ID is, in fact, sufficient for you to access Kenya using your national ID, or Tanzania, or wherever. So I think these are discussions that governments certainly should be having, and as they are part of the discussions of negotiations. Politics, of course, is a key facilitator of trade. You can't, a lot of these agreements are being signed because of political will. Even bringing together the East African community was the political will of those presidents that decided we will therefore trade together. The Africa Continental Free Trade Area has been based on the political will. So you can't separate politics from trade facilitation. It does facilitate trade. The ongoing issues, I think, in the EAC, yes, they're concerning. And governments should certainly deal with them because they are affecting the private sector quite a lot. If Uganda can't export its sugar to Tanzania, it does affect the private sector in Uganda. And discussions are being had by the governments, hence the business forum. But also to put it in context is that you're not going to have necessarily a relationship without ups and downs. It's like expecting to live through life without any one problem. Issues to do with trade matters will happen, and they will come up. Countries may put up a position that may not necessarily be in line with what is agreed. What's important is that there are mechanisms within which they can be resolved. Of course, implementation is going to be a big problem because it's where the heavy lifting actually happens. And therefore, I think countries could and maybe should conduct capacity assessments to figure out, do we have the capacity to actually implement this entire framework as it is? What are the country's comparative advantages? Where do we have the gaps? What is a priority to us right now? And in which sectors do we need to push the most, even as a regional bloc? So I think countries should definitely conduct such assessments to equip themselves sufficiently so that they can implement this quickly and realize the benefits.